To Ururoa Flavell.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Kia ora tātou te whare. Mr. Speaker, it's one of those ironies that here we are tonight considering legislation to radically reform the existing criminal proceeds recovery regime while a funding crisis is confronting the 27 community law centres. What does this have to do with criminal proceeds? Very simple, Mr. Speaker. The bill vests the recovery body and the police with the powers to target people and confiscate property under suspicion. There's that element of discretion, of flexibility again, Mr. Speaker. This time last week, we were in the midst of a debate around a new, tougher, leaner measures to control gangs, and I spoke then about the pitfalls of discretion, the dangers of institutional bias, of racism, of prejudice, and their disproportionate toll on Maori. And here we are again. This bill introduces changes in which confiscation of property can now occur without prior conviction. Instead of a single criminal standard of proof, the beyond reasonable doubt measure, there will be a new civil standard of proof based on the balance of probabilities. Mr. Speaker, that's a much weaker test. In a nutshell, the police have greater powers. There's a far lower standard regarding the need for evidence, and to compound matters further, there's going to be even more issues coming out of the fact that 44% of a 44% funding cut affecting the coalition of community law centres. What we know is that legal aid funding is already woefully inadequate to be able to cover for the full costs for preparation that lawyers might reasonably expect to put into these sorts of cases. Mr. Speaker, the immediate impact of the recession is that it is likely to significantly affect free services which are currently available, potentially forcing some centres to close, and that, from our perspective, would be a tragedy. And so, once again, the Maori Party is coming to this House putting out the call to ensure that whānau, hapu and iwi, that all New Zealanders continue to have due access to justice. The question for us is, how can we be sure that Māori will gain access to the quality legal advice and representation that will be needed? Mr. Speaker, the Dunedin Community Law Centre, I understand, said in their submission that the bill will be used primarily to target petty criminals. And it is in that light that we are concerned that criminal law protections for defendants will be reduced by the lower civil law standards. We have concerns with who may be targeted. We have concerns for innocent parties. We have concerns about the adequacy of legal aid and legal funding. And we're concerned at the breach of human rights, such as the breach of minimum trial rights, the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that we absolutely agree with the submission from the Human Rights Commission that there must be measures put in place to deter criminal activity. The question is, are the extreme measures proposed in this bill the only means of achieving these changes? The challenge that the Human Rights Commission lays down is one which I think the House must give consideration to. Is it worth sacrificing principles of justice to recover criminal assets? In other words, does the end justify the means? Well, the Maori Party cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, accept that it is acceptable for any piece of legislation to be inconsistent with our international commitments and human rights laws, as this one is. And let no one in this House forget that New Zealand, as an international state, faces the shame of having breached a raft of international treaties in the form of the foreshore and seabed legislation. Let no one in this House forget that the trauma of Operation 8 carried out in the attack on the Ururoa during 2008 drew international condemnation for the way in which it universally stigmatised the people of the Tūhoe Nation as terrorists. And let no one in this House forget that only 4 countries in the world voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a declaration affecting over 350 million Indigenous peoples globally. Mr. Speaker, we have a chance to put things right. The Maori Party is aware that both Australia and the United States have already indicated a willingness to reconsider their negative vote against the declaration. And with a new government in place, a government that is committed to mana maintenance and enhancement, we are in a strong position to live up to our international commitments, to demonstrate leadership in acknowledging the human rights of Indigenous people and to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But in the meantime, While that process is in flow, we must not, as a parliament, continue to sit by and allow fundamental principles of justice to be blatantly disregarded. A couple of barristers to the Select Committee I've heard, namely Rob Ware and Dr Donald Stevens, were quite clear that the bill breaches the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act entitlement to a fair hearing, and this needs noting. Mr Speaker, there is one very significant issue that we will be wanting to raise at the Select Committee stage. This is the issue about the right to appeal forfeiture ordered decisions. We believe there's an inadequate provision. There is inadequate provision for people to be able to appeal forfeiture ordered decisions. The bill will confiscate property from persons engaging in or profiting from, quote, significant criminal activity, end of quote, via forfeiture orders. Mr Speaker, the new measures introduced in the bill propose that confiscation of properties or the assessed value of criminal proceeds can occur without prior conviction. Where this becomes a particular threat for many of the constituents that I have is that, for example, a whānau could potentially lose their ancestral land from another person growing cannabis, for example, on their farm without their consent or knowledge. We're therefore of the view that in the bill there should be some specific exclusion of Maori customary land, Maori freehold land declared general land pursuant to Part 1, Section 6 of the Maori Affairs Amendment Act 1967, and any lands returned to iwi under deeds and settlement legislation. We're very concerned about any threat to our whenua, and we will be providing an SOP which addresses our concerns. We're very concerned about the potential for huge unfairness with the precarious nature of the civil balance of probabilities test, and in particular with no opportunities for fair review of the decision. We're concerned that those accused may be unable to properly defend themselves. We're concerned that this bill may see New Zealand breach its international obligations regarding the right to legal representation and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights to which New Zealand is a party. We're concerned at the breach of the number of human rights and freedoms in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, including the right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure, possibly of double jeopardy, as mentioned by my colleague Matiria Ture, the fact that the bill is incompatible with a human rights approach to the development of policy. Mr Speaker, there is one glimmer of hope embedded in the bill, and that is the fact that the bill may just provide an opportunity to introduce a liability for casino and poker machines operators when profiting from the criminal offending of their customers. At present, even when problem gamblers are convicted of theft or fraud, there is no ability to recover the monies from gambling operators. However, although we as a party are totally committed towards eliminating the social hazard that we recognise in gambling, this one issue simply isn't sufficient to be able to turn our minds away from the breaches and human rights infringements that are associated with the Criminal Proceeds Recovery Bill. In that regard, Mr Speaker, the Māori Party will not support this bill.